This book definitely sometimes gives the impression that one is reading the notes of an insane man and a genius. He's both at the same time. Better than food, man. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Great to see you as always. Hope you're doing well. Get that coffee if you got it. I've had way too much, so I'm just going to continue on. Can't drink as much coffee as I get older as I used to could. 1.5 cups. After that, I'm just like Gene Wilder in Blazing Saddles. I have got one strange book for you today. Today is the American author Richard Brautigan's very strange novella, Trout Fishing in America, published in 1967. This thing, that's him on the cover there, with that big hat and the mustache. A fair bit of the book actually discusses the cover. This is the blurb on the back from the Viking Press. I think it sums up what we're going to be talking about. Mr. Brautigan submitted a book to us in 1962 called Trout Fishing in America. I gather from the reports that it was not about trout fishing. So indeed, this is a book that could be described as a book about trout fishing in America that is absolutely not about trout fishing in America or anywhere else. Richard Brautigan has been called the last of the beats, the beat poets and the beat authors of the 50s and 60s, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, various others. He was popular in writing mostly during the 60s and 70s. He had a serious look, like fashion-wise, he had a handlebar mustache and an affinity for these enormous wide-brimmed hats. Kind of looked like a gothic cowboy. I'm pretty sure Alejandro Jodorowsky totally stole his look for his film The Holy Mountain. My stepdad actually introduced me to him. I got a hold of a volume with 3 of his works, A Confederate General from Big Sur, which I remember being terrific, very funny, as well as Dreaming in Babylon and The Hawkline Monster. I thought A Confederate General from Big Sur was great, actually, and it was written before this one, actually, and I will review that one day. But that was the first of his that I've read, and that was the first of his that was written, I believe. It must have been my first beat novel, actually, or novella, and also my first introduction to what I'd discovered to be magical realism. But the Brautigonian variety is one strange strain, you know what I mean? He reminds me a little bit sometimes of Leonora Carrington. His stories are, how do you describe Richard Brautigan? It's like goofball beat poetry nonsense that suddenly perplexes you with lines and moments of heavy literary substance. Whether comedic, dramatic, or tragic, he actually often moves seamlessly between the three. It's impressive. It's dreamlike, which everybody says, surreal, dreamlike, and what have you. It operates on its own kind of insane logic. Brautigan is a total oddball, right? I mean, a complete oddball, a real weirdo, like a true weirdo. While I'm sure many have attempted, like William S. Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, and Hunter S. Thompson, you couldn't write like him if you tried. He's just too idiosyncratic. You can't copy him. He's too weird. He's too unto himself. He's too authentic in that respect. He was a pure eccentric, and actually probably legitimately insane. Richard Brautigan, and no human on earth in history and time has ever been better suited for this label. Richard Brautigan was a weirdo. Like, for real. Of the purest variety. He possessed an organic weirdness, an authentic weirdness. One that was so genuine and authentic that it was quickly recognized and made famous by the counterculture movement of the 60s that was searching for and encouraging this type of personality. So he really hit the zeitgeist, right? He tapped it. And Brautigan became very famous for a few years in San Francisco after the publishing of Trout Fishing in America. It was the book that launched him into the cultural awareness. And, the look definitely helped, the whole personality, the whole package. There was tons of partying, he slept with hundreds of women, and some men too, apparently. Ironically, according to this article I've linked below by Kirby Olson, Brautigan hated hippies. He and the actor Dennis Hopper actually had a falling out because Hopper felt that Brautigan had become too conservative. But anyways, it was a wild life, it was a wild time. Back to his writing. It seems he started writing poetry to try and learn how to construct sentences, with his ultimate intention being to write novels. I think that's an awesome way to start writing. This is certainly apparent in this novella. This thing, it's like bizarre. It's kind of like you're reading a Captain Beefheart record, but it's more enjoyable. It's 100% American beat poetry insanity. He forges his style entirely his own. One with a great deal of tangential randomness, to the point where I just gave up trying to figure out what was going on and just let myself drift downstream, so to speak. It's an experiment with the nature of language, right? The English language. It's a narrative that turns into a poem, that turns into a joke, that turns back into a narrative. There are recurring characters, settings, words, and themes. Trout fishing in America, naturally. But also sheep. And mayonnaise. God knows why. It's kind of a zen experience reading Richard Brautigan. You kind of just relinquish control and give up trying to figure him out. It's a lot like life. It's a lot like relaxing in life. And somewhere within that submission, you gain a certain clarity of his work. But I couldn't describe it to you or tell you how to get there. I have no idea why Brautigan's writing is so hysterical, but it is. It contains a kind of odd, flat, face value humor not unlike Mitch Hedberg, where the sentence is almost inane because it's so irrelevant, yet true, but so completely useless nobody would ever say it, therefore surprising and hilarious. I mean, it's pure absurdism. His stories operate on dream logic, right? Like crazy shit will just occur when you're dreaming and you'll be like, oh yeah, of course it was supposed to happen that way. Makes total sense. Of course I'm supposed to drive the hyena to business school this morning. It's what I do. He carries the same kind of down and out West Coast Californian counterculture humor that you'd expect to find in Kerouac and Bukowski. Kind of slovenly, sometimes vulgar, scatological, stupid, but often laugh out loud funny. There's nothing traditional in the form of narrative plot or character development. It's kind of like Pynchon without the technical writing. It feels like the diary of a beat poet who filled it with imaginative jokes while on a fishing trip in Idaho, which is exactly what it is. Trout Fishing in America is the name of, I think, actually, multiple characters in the novel. The phrase comes to represent many different things in the book. Like they call, some guy, Trout Fishing in America. That's his name, his full name. And a strange, eccentric fellow in a wheelchair, a wino named Trout Fishing in America Shorty, who basically just harasses the general public downtown in San Francisco, I think. And those bits were hysterical. Yeah, those were very funny. Trout Fishing in America Shorty used to go down to La Italia, the Italian newspaper in North Beach at Stockton and Green Streets. Old Italians gather in front of the newspaper in the afternoon and just stand there, leaning up against the building, talking and dying in the sun. Trout Fishing in America Shorty used to wheel into the middle of them as if they were a bunch of pigeons, bottle of wine in hand, and begin shouting obscenities in fake Italian. Spaghetti! I remember Trout Fishing in America Shorty passed out in Washington Square, right in front of the Benjamin Franklin statue, which is on the cover here. He had fallen face first out of his wheelchair and just lay there without moving, snoring loudly. Above him were the metal works of Benjamin Franklin like a clock, hat in hand. Trout Fishing in America Shorty lay there below, his face spread out like a fan in the grass. Yeah, they eventually ship him across the country to Chicago, I think. Like in a crate. Alive. They write occupation wino on there. Name, Trout Fishing in America Shorty, occupation wino, care of some dude in Chicago. I think I've read that it's kind of a commentary on American culture, but I don't know if you could even go that far, really. I think it's just kind of total absurdism. Yeah, I think it's just bonkers. Like it's just kind of like fucking around, right? Like he's just seeing like what he can do. This book was so influential, though. Apparently there was a guy who changed his name, legally changed his name to Trout Fishing in America. An American guy in the 90s. So I believe he goes by Trout America. Fishing in is his middle name. True story. There's also a darkness within Brautigan's work. He had a pretty bad end, but we'll talk about that later. In the meantime, Trout Fishing in America the shipping of Trout Fishing in America Shorty to Nelson Algren was hysterical to me, but this was actually the one that made me laugh the most, I think. Anyways, we'll see if I can get through it without laughing. It's where he goes trout fishing near a graveyard. Trout fishing on the Bevel. The two graveyards were next to each other on small hills, and between them flowed Graveyard Creek, a slow-moving funeral procession on a hot day creek with a lot of fine trout in it. And the dead didn't mind me fishing there at all. One graveyard had tall fir trees growing in it, and the grass was kept Peter Pan green all year round by pumping water up from the creek, and the graveyard had fine marble headstones and statues and tombs. The other graveyard was for the poor, and it had no trees, and the grass turned a flat tire brown in the summer and stayed that way until the rain, like a mechanic, began in the late autumn. There were no fancy headstones for the poor dead. Their markers were small boards that looked like heels of stale bread. Devoted slob father of, beloved work-to-death mother of. On some of the graves were fruit jars and tin cans with wilted flowers in them. Sacred to the memory of John Talbot, who at the age of 18 had his ass shot off in a honky-tonk. November 1, 1936. This mayonnaise jar with wilted flowers in it was left here 6 months ago by his sister, who is in the crazy place now. Eventually, the Seasons would take care of their wooden names like a sleepy short-order cook cracking eggs over a grill next to a railroad station, whereas the well-to-do would have their names for a long time written on marble hors d'oeuvres like horses trotting up the fancy paths to the sky. I fished Graveyard Creek in the dusk when the hatch was on and worked some good trout out of there. Only the poverty of the dead bothered me. Once, while cleaning the trout before I went home in the almost night, I had a vision of going over to the poor graveyard and gathering up grass and fruit jars and tin cans and markers and wilted flowers and bugs and weeds and clods and going home and putting a hook in the vise and tying a fly with all that stuff and then going outside and casting it up into the sky, watching it float over clouds and then into the evening star. Not as much care was given to the poor graves. Yeah, I thought that was very funny. I was going to suggest that nobody outside of America would really get this book or Bradigan's writing, but after thinking about it for a moment, even though it is very American, the fact that it takes place in America seems almost like incidental. Like his kind of weirdness is something that probably actually I think would cross cultures. That would actually appeal to other countries and cultures because it did with the Japanese actually. It's not like Bradigan fit in with the Beats. He didn't, or the hippies. He didn't really fit in anywhere. I think, in his own words, the only place that he fit in, or he felt most comfortable, was Japan, actually. He had a hard time in general, I think. He didn't have good parents at all. His childhood was filled with a kind of horrific poverty. When he was a teenager, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and given electroshock therapy at a hospital in Oregon. He lived in San Francisco, among many other places, including Tokyo. When trout fishing in America came out, it seems that it confused people just as much as it does today. There's a great commemorative article in Rolling Stone that I've linked to below. It's like 9 pages long, but it's totally worth the read. As it says, he began writing this book on a camping road trip with his first wife and their baby daughter, Ianthe. And this was in 1961. And this was in Idaho. Right? The camping road trip was in Idaho. And there's a part in the book where he describes being 15 minutes away from Ketchum, which was the last residence of Hemingway. And he describes being there, 1961 was the year that Hemingway killed himself. And so he describes in the book fishing about 15 minutes down the road from Ketchum and not knowing that Hemingway had already killed himself. And I thought that might have been fiction, but it turns out that was actually probably a real story. That was a true story. And Virginia would eventually leave him for one of his friends. Bradigan was not an easy person to get along with from the sounds of it. There was actually a neighbor of his named William Hjortsberg, I think, that wrote a whole biography about him called Jubilee Hitchhiker. It's like 900 pages or something. It's kind of insane because, I think Hjortsberg's wife actually had an affair with Bradigan. This guy was definitely interesting. It takes a lot to write a 900-page biography of a guy who had sex with your wife. So, yeah, I don't know. Different time, right? His daughter, Ianthe Bradigan, actually wrote a memoir as well that I'd like to read called You Can't Catch Death. What he was working on, The Streamsides of Idaho, was one of the most original, playful works of the American language. A work of eccentric brilliance, a book that broke apart ordinary notions of fiction and experience, then reconstructed both with such whimsy and such startling metaphors that critics would not know if it was genius or insanity. And that occurred to me as well, given the electroshock treatments in the hospital. This book definitely sometimes gives the impression that one is reading the notes of an insane man and a genius. He's both, at the same time. He's not unlike Antonin Artaud, actually, who also was subjected to the same horrific treatment. One doesn't know how serious to take Bradigan, right? It's almost as though nothing or everything is serious. A lot of the comedy comes from the poetic juxtaposition of heavy pathos with goofy nonsense. And that's him in a nutshell, basically. One article below from Nick Rapatrazzoni says, it's silly and whimsical. The worst thing that could happen to trout fishing in America is to inflate its importance. Yeah, I mean, like, he's not diagnosing like a... He's not making like a commentary on society with trout fishing in America. And I think perhaps people, that it seemed to be kind of like a popular thing to do at the time if you wanted to be a serious author. But I mean, he's really not about that, he's off experimenting with his own things. It's kind of masturbatory, but it's also so outrageously individual that it's really hard to, even if you don't like it, and it's definitely not for everybody, it's really hard to ignore as a kind of progression in literature. One thing I found remarkable in this book was the seeming total lack of interest in the question of God, because it's so conspicuously absent, as if he truly had a total and sincere disinterest. It turns out he was a very religious kid, apparently. Which is fascinating to me. I mean, he was going to all sorts of different churches. I think he was Catholic originally, but he seemed to have totally abandoned it somewhere in adulthood. There are critics to his work, though, including a publisher of his, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who started City Lights Bookstore in San Francisco. who said that as an editor, he was always waiting for Brautigan to grow up and shed his naive style and childlike perception of the world. To be fair, myself, I thought the book was a drag by the end. I did. Some of the stories are so impenetrable, there's just nothing to entertain or engage the reader, at least in my case. Some of the humor, while strange, definitely falls flat for sure, for me. It feels dated, it feels dusty, it feels of its era, which is like, you know, a billion years ago. But overall, the snapshot of a personality and sense of humor and time and place is so distinct and unique. It's hard not to enjoy the trip, at least to some degree. So Artaud had heroin, Brautigan had alcohol. Don Carpenter, the author of the brilliant Hard Rain Falling, which I reviewed and I'd highly recommend to everybody, was a good friend of his and said that at one point during his binges, he was drinking a bottle of brandy and 2/5 of whiskey a day. Yeah, that's enough to kill a man. I mean, yeah. Brautigan became very famous and then lost almost all of it, right? Broke, disliked, divorced, dejected, and alcoholic, he inhabited a seriously rough place in his late 40s. Sadly, he committed suicide in 1984 at the age of 49 in Bolinas, California, with a .44 Magnum. They didn't find his body for over a month. It's pretty brutal. Don Carpenter himself became ill and followed a similar path in the mid-90s. Rest in peace, guys. I've linked to a Swiss interview below, just 1 year before he killed himself. He's a dark character, but very curious, very much unto himself. There definitely was a moment in there reminiscent of Hemingway fishing for trout in Spain in The Sun Also Rises. One can't help but wonder about Brautigan's death and whether Hemingway had any influence on it. Brautigan was big in Japan, quite literally at 6'4", just like me. Well, 6'3 3/4", but who's counting? I wonder if Brautigan read Mishima. I'd have a hard time believing he didn't, or wasn't aware of him, at least, you know. To my knowledge, I believe that Mishima was, to some degree, inspired by Hemingway's suicide. Haruki Murakami was inspired by Brautigan. I thought that was interesting. There's an author whose books I still need to read. I tried A Wild Sheep Chase. I wasn't crazy about it. I should try a different one. I've never read another author like him, and I don't expect to. Better Than Food. Better Than Trout Fishing in America. Check it out. So you should read it. Well, yeah, if you're a fan of Don Carpenter, Jack Kerouac, Thomas Pynchon, Richard Farina, Charles Bukowski, and Ernest Hemingway, definitely check it out. There's a strange film called Tarpon made in 1973 by a French documentarian all about tarpon fishing in Key West as opposed to trout fishing in America. But it features the author's Richard Brautigan looking totally out of his normal habitat and the Michigan author Jim Harrison all on a fishing trip down in the Keys. It's a very strange film. It's a cool historical document, you know. Hard to find though. All right. Well, no coffee here, but coffee time. For those of you who are new, thank you very much for stopping by and watching. I take all the names of the patrons on Patreon who have donated $5 more per video to the show. I place their names in this mason jar, and I pull out a name for every review. And whoever's name I pull out, I send them a hard copy of the book I'm reviewing, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And currently the coffee is from Sumatra, and it's delicious. If you would like to get in on that and help support the show, I really appreciate it. Thank you. You can click on the link below or go to patreon.com/booksarebetterthanfood and donate $5 more per video to the show. And I sincerely appreciate it. Thank you very much. Keeps this whole thing going. For donating $1 more on Patreon, you'll get all these reviews ad-free, plus you'll get access to the Discord channel, the Patreon-only reviews, plus a Better Than Friday newsletter, which is just a list of 5 different things that I'm interested in at any given time. Could be books in the pipeline, films, articles, music, changes week to week. And if your name is selected, I sign a bookmark and send that to you as well. And international shipping is included. So, cool. Thank you very much to all the patrons, and best of luck. Okay, here we go. Robert R. Thank you very much, Robert. Really appreciate it. You're going to receive this awesome vintage copy of Trout Fishing in America by Richard Brautigan, plus a bag of coffee from Sumatra, but roasted here in Florida. And I hope you love both. Thank you so much. I hope you laugh as much as I did. I laughed quite a bit. Please subscribe if you have not already, and hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this, and always remember, bring a book wherever you go. All right, take care of yourselves. Have a great night. Talk to you soon. Ciao.